Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session, Creating Inclusive, Diverse, and Culturally Relevant OER. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. We're going to be speaking about two specific EDI initiatives that we are undertaking at BC Campus. But before we do that, let's do some introductions. My name is Clint Lalonde, and I'm the Acting Director of Open Education at BC Campus. My pronouns are he and him. And I am joining you today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation, also known as Victoria, British Columbia, where I've been an uninvited settler since 1994. I originally hail from Treaty 6 territories on the Canadian Prairies, which is the traditional territories of the Cree, Chippewa, and Stoney Nations. Chanelle?
Thanks, Clint, and thanks to everyone for coming this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm Chanelle Tai. I'm an equity and inclusion advisor, an external consultant for BC Campus. My company is Chanelle Tai Equity and Inclusion. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and I grew up on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga of the Credit, and Haudenosaunee people in what's colonially known as Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I was born on the territory of the Arawak Lakonos in South America. Thanks again for having us, and I'll pass it on to Josie.
Thanks, Chanelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Josie Gray. I'm very grateful to be joining you all today. I am the manager of production and publishing on the open education team at BC Campus. I use she, her pronouns, and for those who can't see me, I am a white woman in my late 20s with mid-length blonde hair, glasses, and a septum piercing. And I'm very grateful to be joining you today from Mohkinstsis, which is what the Blackfoot call the area that is now the city of Calgary. And this place is territory that is covered by Treaty 7, which was signed in 1877 by the Crown, the Blackfoot Nation, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai nations, also the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley nations. And this place is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I am very grateful to be here and also to share this virtual space with you all today, wherever you're based in the world.
All right, let's get on. Before we talk about the two specific EDI initiatives, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for what we're going to talk about today and a little bit of background about BC Campus, if for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. BC Campus is funded by the Ministry of Advanced Education, Skills and Training here in the province of British Columbia. We also receive some money from the Hewlett Foundation for the work that we do in open education. We provide support for open education to the 25 public post-secondary institutions here in the province of British Columbia. One of the ways that we do that is we provide system grants for the creation and adoption and adaptations of open educational resources, specifically open textbooks and open courses. And we provide different types of support for authors and adapters around technology choice and use, instructional design, licensing, all the things that kind of go into managing large open education projects. We also maintain a collection of 400 open textbooks and open courses at collection.bccampus.ca, and we support a provincial-wide shared instance of Pressbooks, which is our collaborative authoring and adapting platform for authoring and adapting open educational resources. We've been working in the open education space for many years, close to 20 years now, if we go back to the roots of BC Campus. The big project that we have is our open textbook project, which is celebrating 10 years this year. And we have just passed the $30 million student savings mark, and we're pretty proud of the work that has gone into our open textbook initiative. Open courses for us is a fairly new initiative. We did some early on in the early days of BC Campus, but recently we have begun working on open courses again to expand our open textbook collection into open courses. And this was really brought on by the pandemic pivot. When the pandemic happened and everybody was pivoting to online, there was a great demand for online courses all of a sudden, and need, like our system, like every other system, to scale up online offerings. So we received some funding from the government to develop some openly online licensed online courses that could be shared and used by any institution within the province. So we use this new funding as an opportunity to really examine how we incorporate EDI into the development process. We wanted to deepen our EDI work and really kind of emphasize it during the creation of open educational resources and make it front and center with the development of our curricular resources. So we developed two strategies when we received this extra funding. We decided to bring on an EDI consultant to actually work with us and work with our open course grantees. And we also developed a set of guiding principles, a document that we provide to development teams to think about a number of EDI, accessibility, and pedagogical issues as they develop their OER, and to come up with a statement that can be included with the OER that outlines the intentionality around their design. So we're going to talk about both of those strategies today. And so I'm going to hand it over to Chanelle right now to talk about the work that that she has done with our open courses. Oh, Chanelle, I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you.
There you go.
So my job in this project was to be the EDI external consultant to take a look at building online courses with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in mind. And so I want to just kind of place this in where we were and talk about a couple of challenges that we saw as we were creating OER courses with EDI in mind. So understanding that that OER is new, but schooling is old and learning and teaching are even more ancient. One of the things that we noticed, or one of the gaps that showed up as we were creating courses, is that the course authors were reproducing how and what we learned about whatever topic they were creating a course for in a colonial kind of way. And so my job in partnership with BC Campus was to kind of guide them along and push them towards thinking about equity, and while also acknowledging that there have always been people who challenge the status quo within education, and the climate in which we were is that there was a renewed interest in funding for EDI because of the pervasiveness of access to social movements like Black Lives Matter, trans inclusion, refugee crises, religious freedom movements, bodily autonomy. And they've all had recent spotlights in the media. And because it was a pandemic, we were all trapped in our houses and to take it all in. So this was a really great place for us to restart this work. And it was really heartening because many educators are already ready to be engaged in this change, or have already been engaged in this change and fighting the good fight. We've noticed some barriers as we're creating these courses. There's no standard criteria for social justice frameworks in course design right now. And there aren't systemic supports for course designers either. And because we only know what we know, and because course designers tend to come from similar but not identical backgrounds, we were kind of coming up against, like just some ignorance, and that's okay. We're all learning. As you all know, course designers obviously have a similar background because we pull them from people who have become professors or instructors. So you've got to have, at least a certain amount of education, a certain amount of wealth. There's a lot of other diversity that happens and that happened in this project, or that we saw in this project. So that was refreshing. But we did have the barriers in that we have the same kind of people trying to create something new and different. And then one of the challenges that we noticed, or that I noticed when we were trying to move towards JEDI work in this, is sometimes there's a squirrel trying to eat my tulip bulbs outside. So if you just heard something, it was a wily squirrel. So some of the challenges that we saw were that some of the course designers felt a kind of ownership to their course. So either they've already taught the course, they've already created the textbook, and so it's a little bit hard to let go of this baby that you've created. And so there was some resistance there. The squirrel is really determined. It is, I'm not going to have any tulips by the end of this session. And another challenge is that we faced was trying to create buy-in. So for some folks, there was this a kind of resistance that manifested itself by, when we suggested taking time to ask an Indigenous elder or to research how this course might benefit from Indigenous inclusion, there was like a little bit of resistance. I don't have time to do that. It seemed like an add-on as opposed to, a foundational piece. And so just educating people about why these things are important was part of our challenge. And then something that was kind of interesting across kind of the spectrum of our course designers was a lack of background knowledge. So this was true both for newcomers to Canada. For example, people who didn't know some of the nuances of language. So we had folks using terms that are technically right, but also technically racist. And so they were very open to learning more. It was just from ignorance that they didn't know. The other challenge that we had is for people who didn't face a lot of systemic oppression, not understanding how cultural relevance and kind of a softness in the approach would be beneficial for people who were marginalized. So that's the climate and the change that we've had. And so now I kind of want to move on to how we supported people to design with EDI in mind. So there are three kind of stages to this project. The first is pre-design. How do we get this right from the very, very beginning? Then the conception. As we're creating this course, how are we ensuring that equity deserving groups are represented? And then finally, the evaluation. How do we make sure we're doing this right over and over and over again? So the pre-design phase, here's some questions. You feel free to screenshot this. These are some of the questions that I asked and led people through as we're doing the pre-design. And I will say that in this particular project, we didn't really start with pre-design because I was brought on after people were chosen to create their courses. But if I were to do it again, this is how we would do it. We would start with choosing the right kind of people. So diverse course designers who have lived experience from equity deserving groups who have proven EDI or JEDI analysis. That's who we should choose. And so that's the first thing that we do when we're doing equitable course design. And in the application phase, we're asking, hoping to ask people, how do they address or how will they address equity, diversity, and inclusion and justice issues? This weeds out deniers, people who are like, we're all fine, everything's great, nothing needs to change. So we're not hiring people who we already have a resistance to this work with. And it's really important to ask course designers to prove how they've demonstrated a sustained commitment to equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. Because it's not enough to just have a feeling that those things are important. It's better to have a track record where you've shown trying and failing, trying and succeeding. So that's an important thing in the pre-design stage. And then for the next stage, conception, I've outlined a number of questions that we can ask as we're doing this work. Because creating a course with EDI in mind is about as much what is taught and what isn't taught, but also how it's taught. And I'll just break that down really quickly for y'all right now. When we're thinking about what is taught, a great question to ask to start with is how diverse are the scholars that you've chosen? And are the resources that you have put as like exemplars in your work, in your course, are they explicit about ways of being and knowing that are outside typical colonial ways of being and knowing, and that those ways are lauded? So for example, Indigenous ways of being are lauded and appreciated. So I'll give you an example. A probability course, for example, can include how Indigenous people in the area historically predicted how many salmon would return. That's an example. You can tell I'm from BC because we got an ocean and lots of salmon. Another thing to think about in the conception is really moving away from a deficit stereotype model. So focusing on scenarios and stories. But a really easy win is to focus on the visuals. Are your graphics and videos diverse? Do they show a range of age, gender, sex, ability, and race? Are they not reinforcing deficit stereotypes? So for example, something that came up was the image of a fat person used to illustrate someone who lacks willpower or discipline, the image of a smiling, shirtless Black child to represent gratitude for learning or ingratitude for learning. And it's like placed in sub-Saharan Africa. There are lots of ways to show a Black child or a Black person in a much more positive light. Another question to ask is, in the course design, are there opportunities for the students of this future course to think critically about their previous learning experiences in the subject area, and how that learning upheld a dominant view or colonial view? And then a couple of other things. The course calendar is a really easy place to encourage instructors who take up the course to include culturally inclusive days, holidays, things like that. So not just, Happy Persian New Year, but having a note that says something about, I'm aware that this course may fall on the Persian New Year. If you are fasting or feasting, please let me know. I will make accommodations for you, something like that. And then finally, in terms of what is and isn't taught, is your cultural references, making sure that they're relevant to all learners. So new arrivals, language learners, older learners, younger learners who come from a diverse cultural background. There was lots of idioms and not a lot of plain language. So moving people out of that is a really great way to include EDI. And then one last piece in the conception part is in the conception phase is UDL and EDI go hand in hand. So when we talk about plain language, when we talk about, and UDL is Universal Design for Learning, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's using plain language, having accessibility at top of mind, like alt text course activities in Moodle that are easily clickable, graphics that have simple, that are super simple for screen readers, are helpful for those who are visually impaired, that your evaluations are such that you're not penalizing people because they don't understand something that isn't actually part of the content. So that's an important part in what we're doing and how we approach this particular project. And then after the conception phase, there's the evaluation phase. And that phase, we're still in this phase. This work is iterative, and you have to keep returning to it along the way. And when I talk about evaluation, I'm talking about the course evaluation, the evaluation, how have we done in terms of making this OER course equitable, diverse, inclusive, full of justice. It's not a one-off evaluation. It's an ongoing process. And it's one through which a course author revisits the questions that we have here. What else can we improve, and how do we pass on our commitment to people who take up this course, to instructors who use this to teach their own students. And we revisit this question multiple times before we have a final product, but then after it's out into the world, we still revisit it and we still make these changes. So this is this particular project of trying to infuse EDI into OER courses. And then Josie has a really great tool, document, framework. I don't know what you ended up calling it, and I'll let her talk about that.
Thank you so much, Chanelle. I really appreciate hearing all of your thoughtful questions and the insight you bring to the courses and the OER work that we're doing. It's super appreciated. So now I wanted to share with you all a resource that I've been working on with Clint. This resource was developed separately from the work Chanelle has been doing, but our motivation for creating it came from a recognition that the work Chanelle is doing with OER creators is so important, and that not everyone creating OER has access to someone with Chanelle's expertise. And it also came from a desire to want OER creators to be really intentional about designing and creating for equity and inclusion from the very beginning of a project, and to encourage people to communicate that work to people who come to use that OER in the future. So this resource has gone through a number of names and iterations, but for now we're calling it Guiding Questions, Creating OER with Intention. This resource is currently available in Google Docs, so you can review it as I talk about it, and you can access it at bit.ly/OER guiding Q, all in lowercase. I've also put the link into the chat. And keep in mind that these guiding questions are still a draft. We've changed them a lot over the last few months based on feedback we've received, and plan to change them more as we start putting them into practice with OER projects we're working on at BC Campus. But now I wanted to give you a bit more context about what the document is and what our kind of vision and intention is with this document. So the resource outlines 6 areas that we at BC Campus think are important to consider when creating OER to ensure that they improve equity, access, and quality of learning for students. For each area of consideration, there are a number of questions meant to support an author or a project team thinking through the area more concretely. So I won't go through all of the questions that are in the document for each category right now. I'll let you do that on your own time. But the big questions that the document resource asks are, the first is around openness. So why do you want this resource to be open? How might openness inform the creation of the resource? The next is pedagogy. How will this OER support student learning? Then accessibility. How will you ensure all parts of your OER are accessible to disabled students? What about students with limited internet access or access to digital devices? Then Indigenous knowledge. How will Indigenous perspectives be reflected in this material? Then equity and justice. How will this resource reflect and respect the diversity of peoples, cultures, and ways of knowing in the world we live in? And how will it account for the harms and inequities of the world we live in, as well as within this specific field of study? And then finally, positionality. Who is involved in this project? What social positions, experiences, and contexts are they working from? And who is represented in the creation of the resource and who is not? So we hope to put these guiding questions into practice with future OER projects that we are funding at BC Campus. Right now, we envision them being used kind of at the beginning of the project and then again at the end of the project. So at the beginning, the questions can be used to think through the project and document commitments, and they may also help identify where more research or support is needed. And then at the end of the project, the document can be used to kind of reflect on the work that was done and to figure out how to communicate that work to people who may use the OER in the future. So for example, that could look like writing an introduction or a preface to the OER, where you talk about like what informed the creation of the resource and what information you think would be useful to both students and instructors who may use it in the future. The questions can also show what you weren't able to accomplish with the project and identify future possibilities and areas for improvement. We created these guiding questions for a number of reasons. The big reason is getting people thinking about these areas of consideration early, so ideally from the beginning of the project, because the beginning is where you have a lot of potential to really shift your vision and really do the best work. It's, as Chanelle was talking about, it's hard to come in after work is completed or when it's already kind of going one way to kind of shift things at that point. We're also kind of trying to make broad, complex topics like equity a little bit more concrete. We want to give people a place to start and also help them identify where they may need support. We also hope to encourage people to be transparent about what informed the creation of the OER and communicate that to future users. And finally, we are also using this document as one way of communicating BC Campus's expectations and values to the people that we're working with. As I mentioned in the beginning, these questions are still in draft. We are very open to feedback and ideas and plan to continue iterating on the document. The Google Doc does have commenting and suggesting permissions turned on, so feel free to leave questions, thoughts, ideas in that document. And I've also put my email somewhere in that document, so if you want to contact me directly with anything about it, you're welcome to do that as well. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Clint for some time for questions.
Thank you both. We do have a few minutes left for questions. I know I'm seeing a lot of people in the Google Doc. Thank you so much. If you do have suggestions or comments, as Josie said, please feel free to add your suggestions, leave some comments about the document, as this is still a work in progress, and we will be in perpetual draft, I think, with this document as we go through different rounds of open education funding in the future. If there's any questions in the chats, let's just take a quick look through here. Let's see if I can see anything.
For those of you who are wondering, the squirrel has vacated my balcony. We're good to go.
Some good resources being shared in the chat, some sources for diverse images. I hope you will have tulips come the spring. Veronica, I'm curious if your support team for course designers includes working with instructional designers. Yes. In fact, the person who was leading the open course development was an instructional designer that we had seconded for 2.5 years, Melanie Myers from the Justice Institute in BC. And Mel was the one who actually led the development of the open course team, the open course development team.
And each course author was paired with an instructional designer who was part of the EDI advising committees not committees, meetings that we had too. So there was both instructional design, JEDI, and content experts in the room.
Dan's question, how much thought was given to creating content that can be easily modified? Quite a bit. With our course, we tried to create the courses as modularly as possible. Many of our courses do take sort of a lowest common denominator when it comes to technology. So we have a lot of Word documents that have things like activities and resources in them. And we also have a couple of courses that have been developed using Pressbooks, which is a textbook authoring platform, but also can be extended to really include some of those course elements that you might see in something more than a course or more than a textbook. That would be course, like activities and assignments and things like that.
There was another question from Jennifer. It says, thank you for a wonderful presentation, in particular, the importance of not supporting harmful stereotypes in examples and images. I'm wondering if you had any pushback on that.
I wouldn't say I had real pushback. I think people, sometimes their initial reaction is a little bit defensive because we don't necessarily mean to do things that support harmful stereotypes. But for the most part, that one was an easy win, I would say. Most people don't want to be using images or graphics or videos or whatever that pushes negative stories about other minoritized groups.
Chanelle, there's a good question from Veronica here about the part of your consultation work was focused on advising the IDs on the team in addition to direct consultation with the instructors. Maybe can you talk a little bit about how you and Mel worked together on the project?
I think because I came in a little bit later in in the creation of courses for some of the courses. What was really helpful, Mel already had a pretty good EDI lens. And so she would kind of give me kind of the lowdown. This is who this author is. This is how they work. Here's their history and experience. And that helped me be able to deliver kind of advice in a way that I thought would be more palatable to them. So for example, we had knowing, for example, that somebody had been doing this work in this community, which didn't have a lot of racial diversity or cultural diversity, helped me figure out like, okay, so if I take an example from his work, I can look to who the indigenous people are of that land and give him something that is practical so that he can use it. And so that instructional design piece was important because instructional designers have a longer relationship with instructors and course designers. So I would say that was the most helpful. The other piece that really helped is because I have a UDL, I come from education, so I have a UDL background. The instructional designers or the IDs were really instrumental in helping bridge that conversation between JEDI and UDL in a way that was really understandable for instructors. So I think I would 100% go that route again.
Michelle's question in here, do we have examples of what some of the elements might look like? For example, author statements that include positionality.
I can share an example from my own work. So this wasn't an open textbook or an open course, but I completed my master's last year and my major project was to create a podcast. And so as part of that podcast, I created a website where this was before we started working on these guiding questions, but I think I was asking myself some of these questions for my own project. So on this website, I include a fairly long description about myself, which is kind of describing my own positionality. I also have a manifesto is what I called it. And that was like my own commitments for the project. And also like things that I was saying were guiding how I was thinking about the project. So like, I don't think this is necessarily like how it has to be done, but this is like one example of how I did it for this particular project. I know in terms of like other kind of statements about where authors are kind of describing what work went into the textbook. I know a number of the most recent OpenStax books include kind of introductions that talk about some of these things. So these statements are coming out of a different context by a different organization, but we were looking at those as kind of like models of what we would like to see included in OER that's being created in the BC context as well. So I'll see if I can track down a link to one of those as well.
Apurva had a question earlier. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say the same thing.
Oh, go ahead. Were there any conversations with institutional administrators around the time needed to support equitable OER creation? We ask our grantees to submit guidelines and to provide like timeline guidelines for the projects and to have sign off from their institutional administrators. We didn't have direct conversations with administrators around any increase in time, but one thing that has become, and this was also our first experiment with doing courses, so we weren't sure what the timelines would look like to begin with when we did the call for proposals for open courses. I think one of the things we have learned is that we need to provide more time for the development of open educational resources, not only just the courses that we have developed, but also the textbook work that we're doing. So we organizationally, when we do a call for proposals, we'll be looking at extending the timelines because we're asking authors to not only take on the sort of pedagogical load of developing a textbook or an open course now, but also to maybe add into areas that they aren't as familiar with that will take them some time to be comfortable with learning some new ways of presenting courses and developing courses.
I just wanted to jump in and let y'all know we have 5 minutes left.
Do you have any advice, hypothetically, of course, for developing inclusive educational content in an institution with heavy resistance to EDI?
Do you want my real advice? Um, so I did my master's on kind of systems change and making EDI education actually work within institutions. And here's what I'll say. It's not impossible to make those changes, but in order to really make a change, you need to have change makers at kind of the grassroots level, and you need to have leaders who are on board. So if you don't have a leader who's on board, there's only so far that you can go. You can have kind of siloed or clustered movements. So my suggestion is, if you don't have a useful leadership who's competent in this work or willing to give funding or time or whatever, I'd say find other change makers and work together to make very small, very meaningful changes in your sphere of influence. Having transformational cultural shift is only possible when you have grassroots EDI work and also competent leaders at the top. So that's the unfortunate truth. But my real suggestion is go somewhere else.
I have to say too, like being in, I don't know, there's, certainly some differences. I'm on an EDI working group that is mostly US focused, and, working in a Canadian context, there is certainly a different feeling that we have. And I don't want to undervalue the importance of the work that is, or resistance that might be happening here in Canada. But because it is, but when I hear about what happens to people who are trying to do EDI initiatives in the US, where you have resistance coming at a government political level, perhaps, as well as the institutional level, and the challenges that are faced with the political climate. We do see some of that in Canada, but certainly not to the extent, at least, what I see working on this EDI working group, not to the extent of what I see my US colleagues having to go through. So I feel really, really inadequate to offer advice when you run into some serious resistance that I know people in the US often are. I think we have time for one more question here. I can't see any more questions, so maybe we'll just wrap it up. Great. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you coming today and sharing some time with us. And please leave some comments on the document. We would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions on ways we can improve that document. Thank you.
And feel free to email us. I'm very happy to chat with any of you for any reason.
Thanks so much, everyone.